The evolution of medieval European grain storage techniques from 800 to 1200 CE. Midnight, intro, soft, ambient music begins like gentle harp or faint wind chimes. Visual, slow pan over a grayscale drawing of a medieval village. Good evening, dear listeners. Welcome to another soothing journey into the quiet corners of history. Tonight, we explore the slow, meticulous evolution of medieval European grain storage techniques from the years 800 to 1200 CE, a time of barns, sacks, and careful calculations. Close your eyes, let your mind drift as we wander through the dusty granaries of the past. Pause for 5 seconds. Visual, fading image of a wooden barn. 1 o'clock, setting the scene. In the early medieval period around 800 CE, Europe was a patchwork of fields and villages. Grain, barley, wheat, rye, and oats was the lifeblood of these communities. But storing it, storing it was a task of endless patience. The grain had to be kept dry, safe from pests, and secure from thieves. Let's begin our journey in a small, unremarkable village somewhere in the Carolingian Empire. Pause for 5 seconds. Visual, slow zoom on a sketch of a grain sack. 230. Early storage methods. In the year 800, most grain was stored in simple wooden barns. These barns were unassuming, built from oak or pine with thatched roofs of straw. The walls were not always tight. Gaps let in the wind and sometimes the rain. The grain was often piled on the floor, sometimes on raised wooden platforms, to keep it off the damp earth. But the damp, it always found a way. Farmers used coarse linen sacks woven by hand to hold smaller amounts of grain. These sacks were heavy, rough to the touch, and tied with hemp cords. Each sack could hold perhaps 50 pounds of barley, or maybe 60 pounds of wheat. The exact weight, it varied. No one measured too precisely back then. Pause for 5 seconds. Visual, slow scroll of a parchment sketch of a linen sack. 430. The problem of pests. Pests were a constant concern. Mice, rats, weevils, they loved the grain as much as the villagers did. To keep them at bay, some farmers placed dried herbs like lavender or mint among the sacks. It didn't always work. Cats roamed the barns, silent guardians of the harvest. But even they could not catch every mouse. By 850 CE, some villages began building granaries with stone foundations. Stone was harder for pests to chew through. It was cold, unyielding, and kept the grain just a little safer. These early stone granaries were small, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, with thick walls and a single narrow door. Pause for 5 seconds. Visual, fading image of a stone granary. 630. The role of monasteries. The monasteries, they were the keepers of knowledge in these early centuries. By 900 CE, monks began experimenting with better storage. They built granaries with raised floors supported by short stone pillars. This kept the grain off the ground, away from moisture. The monks were patient. They counted every sack, recorded every bushel in their ledgers. The ledgers were written in Latin, with quill and ink, on parchment that smelled faintly of sheepskin. Each entry was slow, deliberate, noting the type of grain, the weight, and the date it was stored. The monks worked by candlelight, their hands steady, their minds focused. Pause for 5 seconds. Visual, slow pan over a medieval ledger page. 830. Improvements by 1000 CE. By the year 1000, things began to change slowly. Villages grew. The demand for grain increased. New techniques emerged, not quickly, but steadily. Some granaries now had slatted wooden walls to allow air to circulate. This kept the grain drier, less likely to mold. The slats were narrow, carefully measured, perhaps an inch apart. Farmers also began using clay pots, large, heavy pots, to store smaller amounts of grain. These pots were sealed with wooden lids, or sometimes wax. They were heavy, hard to move, but they kept the grain safe from insects. Each pot was marked with a simple scratch to show what was inside. Wheat, barley, rye, oats. Pause for 5 seconds. Visual, slow zoom on a clay pot sketch. 1030. The rise of larger granaries. By 1100 CE, larger granaries appeared, especially near castles and towns. These were built with thicker stone walls, sometimes 2 feet thick. The roofs were still thatched, but some used slate tiles, heavy and gray. Inside, the grain was stored in wooden bins divided by type. Wheat in one bin, barley in another, rye in a third. The bins were built by local carpenters who measured each plank with care. The wood was oak, or sometimes beech, sanded smooth to avoid splinters. The bins were raised just a few inches off the floor to keep the grain dry. The air inside was cool, still, and smelled faintly of earth and straw. Pause for 5 seconds. Visual. Fading image of a wooden bin. 1230. Record-keeping advances. Record-keeping grew more precise by 1100. Lords and monasteries employed clerks, men with steady hands, to track the grain. They used wax tablets, or sometimes parchment, to note the weight of each delivery. A bushel of wheat, perhaps 30 pounds, was weighed on simple balance scales. The scales creaked, swayed, and settled slowly. The clerks wrote slowly, their quills scratching softly. They recorded the source of the grain, the village it came from, the date it was stored. These records were kept in locked chests, safe from prying eyes. The chests were wooden, bound with iron, and smelled of old oak. Pause for 5 seconds. Visual. Slow scroll of a wax tablet sketch. 1430. Challenges of the 12th century. By 1200 CE, grain storage faced new challenges. Populations grew. Harvest had to feed more people. Rats were still a problem, always scurrying, always nibbling. Some granaries now had stone floors, polished smooth, to make it harder for pests to hide. Others used traps, simple wooden devices, baited with bits of cheese or bread. The weather was another foe. Rain could seep through thatched roofs, turning grain to mush. Some lords began investing in better roofs, tiled with slate or clay. These roofs were heavy, expensive, but they lasted longer. The tiles were laid one by one, each one fitted carefully like a puzzle. Pause for 5 seconds. Visual. Slow pan over a slate roof sketch. 1630. The role of the community. Grain storage was a community effort. Every villager had a role, from the farmer who harvested the grain, to the carpenter who built the bins, to the clerk who recorded the weights. Even children helped, chasing mice or sweeping the granary floors. The work was slow, repetitive, but necessary. The granary was a quiet place, a place of order. The sacks were stacked neatly, the bins filled carefully. The air was cool, the light dim, the sounds muffled. It was a place to rest, to think, to let the mind wander. Pause for 5 seconds. Visual. Fading image of stacked grain sack. 1830. Closing thoughts. And so, from 800 to 1200 CE, the storage of grain in medieval Europe evolved slowly, steadily. From simple barns to stone granaries, from linen sacks to clay pots, from rough piles to neat bins. Each change was small, deliberate, unremarkable. Yet each change kept the villages fed, the harvests safe, the winters bearable. As you drift off, imagine the quiet granary, the soft rustle of grain, the faint creak of a wooden bin. Let the monotony of history carry you into a deep, peaceful sleep. Good night, dear listeners. Asterisk. Pause for 10 seconds. Visual. Slow fade to black with. Music fades out. 2000 hours.